Okay. Well, I've been thinking that perhaps the three of us could begin at the beginning.
Yeah.
How did you ever get into this?
Okay, well, let's see. I'm a professor of psychology at Cal State Long Beach. I started working when I got my degree in 1965. So somewhere along the way, I got interested in men's issues, and I started teaching a class in the psychology of male roles around the early 80s. Okay, and in that class, covered a range of issues about gender, scripting, and male identity, etc. And I became somewhat familiar with the work of men as victims in domestic situations. So it was a small unit in a 15-week class. In 1993, a friend of mine has a TV show, a local TV show in Long Beach called To Your Health, Dr. Jack Thomas, and he told me that they were having a program on Domestic Violence Week, and did I know anything about the area? They wanted a male's point of view. So I quoted him some of the work of Murray Strauss, and he says, "Oh, that's great, Marty. Come on the show." So I came on the show. I was one of 5 people. There were four other women and myself, and presented the information that I had told Jack about the work of Murray Strauss and McNeely, and it wasn't really accepted. It wasn't negatively. I wasn't attacked, but I wasn't believed. And from that point, I realized, these women who were involved in the field as a district attorney, as nurses, as people in the courts, as victims, were totally unfamiliar with this. And I was a bit, in my own mind, on shaky ground because I hadn't looked at the literature. I just looked at a review. So I decided, I'm going to pursue this as one of my projects. So I started to look at all the studies that I could find that showed, that looked at male and female victimization in domestic violence. And 3 years later, I published an annotated bibliography, which I thought was interesting, the way to do it, rather than just having the articles, to summarize the key findings in them. And so that was published in a journal called Sexuality and Culture. And once it was published, it got a huge reaction. It was cited a lot. People responded to me on email, etc. And part of the response was people were sending me other articles that I had missed or that had recently been published. So I continued the project and have revised it 4 times in total, the last one being last year. So my work primarily has been as a scholar looking at what has been found in the field. I think there are 343 total articles, 270 empirical studies, a number of reviews. And in the process, I've gotten in touch with a number of researchers and activists, both in the United States and in England, and who we keep up to date with that. I have students who've done, 2 or 3 students who've done theses in this area, master's theses, where we looked at some components of the domestic violence issue, on what are the reasons that women are aggressive with their male partners. So, and then I was pleasantly surprised to be invited to this conference and to be part of the opportunity to share my findings with the group here and a larger audience, and to work with Erin, who I've been in touch with for a number of years, and we had a very pleasant connection when we met in England a few years ago.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And you, Anne, what made you, as this amazing woman, when you put your life on your neck on the line, really, for this, because you certainly have, and you have fought in a lone voice for most of it in the Senate. Would you like to explain to everybody how and what brought you into all this?
I would love to, and it's lovely to see you, and it's lovely to meet you. It's a real pleasure. I would like to say that I've always, from my earliest years as a wee little child, I was always very aware of family relations and family relationships and the quality therein, and also the paucities. I have many recollections of observing children and families. I remember a particular situation next door where I remembered thinking that child was just slapped for no reason and forming judgments as a wee little child. Now, I think I still have those same very sensibilities, but I'm a warrior by nature, a gentle, loving warrior, but a warrior by nature, which means that if I see wrongdoing or injustice, I usually will take a stand. I am wiser and older now, so I choose more judiciously and more wisely. But I became very involved in this issue in the very early years, the early 70s, even the late 60s. I was creating or causing a stir because I was raising the question of relationships between men and women and the use of violence. And we must understand that in those days everybody knew that there were toss-ups and dust-ups in families, and every social agency dealt with it regularly, but no one ever viewed this as a subject matter that was deserving of public policy attention, and which is the great contribution that you have made to humanity, in that you raise these as public policy, social policy issues. And you could say that I was a disciple in Canada, although I was on the subject matter even before you started your shelter. But the way you raised it, I think, has had an enormous impact on the entire world, and I think we should all be grateful for that. I spent a lot of my younger years, when I think I was 19 or 20 years old one summer, and I remember working in what we call a youth protection school, and I was a summer staff. And I remember noting and being very aware at the time that children go astray who don't have mothers and fathers both. I remember making that a connection very early in my career, that father absence or lack of father involvement has a relationship to aggressive behavior. I remember making those conclusions very, very early. But age 20, one doesn't really have the mental capacity or the experience or the full intellectual prowess to write and to connect the facts, the social facts to the legal facts, and to do those kinds of things. But the last many years of my life have just confirmed what I observed in a very empirical, human sensibility, sensitive way. For example, in the years 1980 to 1984, before I was a senator, I served on the National Parole Board for a few years. It's what we call a governing council appointment, and by Her Majesty or Her Majesty's representative. And I observed there again that there were 10,000 federal inmates who were men and maybe 500 that were women. But in those days when you raise these questions, that's just how it is. This is just the fact. But you can say that from the 70s on, right through, I was an active force in the field of domestic violence, building services. We called ourselves innovative services. And because I suppose the issue is so compelling and one which is so close to our persons, it just caught on like wildfire. And before you know it, I was speaking. One fall, I did 50 speaking engagements. And I did every television show whenever I was invited. And my agency became the flagship of the country in the city of Toronto. And what was unique about our agency then, and Erin knows all of this, was that my staff were trained by me to always have an ear for the husband's position. This used to incur the wrath of many of the other shelters, and men were welcome and encouraged to come to us, to speak to us. And I have to tell you, I sat between many husbands and wives and engaged in a process of healing, because you sit between two people like that and you see the distance. You see the distance is so vast, but the closeness is huge, as they have the ability to touch each other's buttons, which add fire very, very quickly. And all of this led into another stage. Like, for example, the very first PhD thesis in Canada was done by a student from York. And he came to me and I introduced him to subjects to interview, provided it was all done in accordance with proper scholastic methods and methodologies. And I still have a copy of his PhD thesis, one of the 3 that he had. I don't know where he is in the world, but I know that in those days they called me a field advisor. And I did that. And I like that experience because it brings scholarship into touch with human reality, which is a wonderful thing. As a result of all of this, for example, in 1977, I organized the very first conference ever on domestic violence in Canada, 1977. And I had the support of a professor from the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education who believed it was important. So, but what I found at all of those times, that it was this issue is so touching and so captivating of human sensibility that I have never found it hard to get support on this behalf. The difficulties arise. So I'm now in my head up to about 1979, 80, and very well known in Toronto for my work. Then I entered the field of politics. One would have to know that I come from a family which was extremely socially active in Barbados, where I was born, in British Caribbean, and a family with a long tradition, 3 or 4 generations of having members of parliament. So it's in my blood in a way, and my mother always talked to me about civic responsibility and my duty to assist others who are not as fortunate and to bring people forward and to lead. So I grew up hearing this. Remember, I went to one of those girls' schools that sat on 10 acres of land with 3 tennis courts and games fields and art studios. But that's in me. It's in my person and in my soul to care, and I don't know how to cure myself of it, and I'm old enough, I don't feel I have to do anything to explain it. It is just how I am. I'm a total package. So, of course, I came to the attention of people who do politics, and before you knew it, I was involved in yet another spectacular event. I tried to get what we call a nomination to the Liberal Party of Canada in 1978, and the result was 2 candidates, the largest nomination meeting ever in the history of Canada. Thousands for 2 candidates. You'll get those thousands, maybe for 10 candidates too. And the Prime Minister himself, who was a great supporter of mine, Mr. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, appeared at this nomination meeting. He never goes to nomination meetings, but he was there. And I will never forget what he said to me, and I will never forget his great support and affection for me, as was his admiration for the work that I did reconciling couples in relationships. And as I look back in time, I myself am understanding it, because I was younger and brave, very brave. I would always go right in. So if we had a husband who had kicked down the door, I'm sure you knew this experience, kicked down the front door and waded into the place, you know, I would call him up and say, "You come and talk to me about that door." So he would come. There's something about human beings in crisis mode, that there's a moment where if you can make that intervention and make contact with that person, you can unravel something very beautiful and very wonderful, because you've touched an area in them that they really want to change, and they'll cling to you like a child.
What
Go
did
ahead.
Trudeau say to you?
Oh, he told me that he thought I had courage
Okay.
many times. These are the beautiful things. When he brought me to the Senate, which was in 1984, he was
Did he appoint you?
Oh yes.
Yeah, oh,
yeah.
that's how it
Yeah,
goes.
he recommended me
Okay.
to the Governor
Okay.
General. Yes, but it's an appointment. He is very interesting. He made me promise. Like he was on the phone. He was on the phone, and he said, "I want to invite you to join the Senate." Right, great, and he said again how much admiration he had for the work that I did. Now remember, we're dealing with a man who went through a divorce. And it took me years to understand what he was saying all along. And he said to me, so often when people go into politics or come to Ottawa, which is the capital, they get uprooted from their roots and the work that they love. He said to me, I want you to promise me that you will never lose interest in this important work of healing couples. Now, I would love to ask him now, because he's been dead many years now, and I would love to ask him, but I promised him that I would never lose my interest. And it was an easy promise to keep, but better than that, my interest ripened, matured, and expanded as legislation came before us that we were seeing as the products of the new ideology that was making its way into every statute, and it was doing it ferociously and rapidly, and things were being changed, and principles that we'd worked for, like for example the Divorce Act that came through Bill C-41 that some of you here will have testified. That act was repealing the equality sections that had been put into the divorce legislation back in 1986. You know, for example, that both spouses have a duty to pay child support. And these equality provisions were being repealed, and also I'm told it was happening in the U.S. because even one of the large women's organization, I think it was now, I forget, I do not know enough about the American situation, repealed their commitment to shared parenting. And because the 1978, the first real large law reform act creating jointness in matrimonial property, here in Ontario it was the flagship legislation. But the attitude in Ottawa, remember, the provinces control here. The provinces control civil rights and property and all that, but the feds control the law of divorce and marriage, very complicated business. And the thrust of the federal government in those years was, couples have agreed to share the property and the liabilities, so the assets and the liabilities, the debts of the relationship. Well, now we're going to share the children. And that was the next big change, that was to move into the divorce law. And if you look through the literature that the then minister who took these initiatives, the literature he was distributing for commentary all over the country from lawyers, you can see it. He was advocating things like maximum access of the children to all siblings and all members of the family, all those kinds of...
And it was equal, shared.
It was equal. It was equal, and the term best interest of the child was introduced into the legislation because obviously the child's first interest has to be its relationship with its own parents. So all of this was being reversed. So anyway, so there I was, and the challenge was before me, and I took it up, and I fought hard on several of these acts, the Divorce Act and the committee, and so on and so forth. And you all know the report. It's legendary now, For the Sake of the Children, where we actually got a recommendation for shared parenting, which was quite a profound thing. And I have some meetings with some of your fellows. I met Dr. Fabricius about a year or two ago. I had a small seminar at the Senate purely for academics, and he was there and he spoke there, and he's been doing wonderful work on this on this item. I think he told me he was working on drafting some legislation for some particular state. And the challenges in carving divorce law right now is to try to keep certain persons from making the Divorce Act a mini criminal code act, because they all want to put in sections into these acts that men, if they were involved in domestic violence, that should be a method, an automatic denial of custody or the joint custody or anything like that. So really
And it's only really men. It doesn't specify.
But it means men.
I know.
But yes, but it's the same paradigm.
Yeah.
If their paradigm is that violence is something men do to women,
Yeah.
well, when they're saying to deny the spouse, it's the man again.
Yes, that's what
they
they
don't.
mean.
Yes, they don't.
I wanted to ask you about this business best interests of the child.
Oh yeah.
In England, we're finding, those of us that are actually working largely with men's movements and what's happening, it's the first time I was thinking, when all this began about the best interest of the child, that in our courts, the people who decide now are not the parents' the best interest. The people who make those decisions are social judges, social workers. So whatever happens, if whatever the parents think, if the judge decides he thinks it's in the best interest of the child, then the parents don't really have any comeback. So in a sense, they've lost their right to be the parents of the child.
Well, the parental interest is subject to the best interest of the child. And I think I might have told you before, but the concept and the term the best interest of the child is born of the law of equity in the Lord Chancellor's courts. And looking after and safeguarding children began as sovereign acts of the king, whose knights had perished in battle and had left large estates behind. Do you remember the old stories, Robin Hood, Maid Marian, Robin Hood? You remember she was a ward of the king. The king was away fighting the Crusades, but she was a ward of the king. So it was a very elaborate process by which that king owed the children, these wee little things, a duty of care to protect their property. And there was a very sophisticated system at a point in time of preserving the property, protecting it, and a point of time that the property was handed over, delivered to the child once the child had reached that age of majority. I think that language hasn't changed. It's still the age of majority. And those were called the courts of wards and liveries, because they delivered back. And what happened as time passed by, and as you know, the 19th century in the UK is probably the most expansive time of social liberation in the entire history of humanity. And in that period of time, beginning somewhere from about 1800, you find that the Lord Chancellor's courts in equity begin to develop this language, the welfare of the child, the interests of the child, the best interests of the child. And I had to search for a year to find where the term best interests of the child came from. And I worked scouring. I'm an antiquarian by nature, scouring through judgments, looking for it, and I found it, and I have it, and I'm going to use it in a speech momentarily. With the advent, the ascendancy of extreme radical gender feminists, basically women are good, men are bad, you find that the term best interests of the child begins to mean the best interests of the mother.
Yeah.
And I have judgments where that is actually said, and I could quote them, but we can't do that here. It's a three-way discussion, where one particular judge stated that the best interest of the child is best protected by securing the best interests of the mother. And I mean, it's sort of blatant, but it is there. And all of a sudden, for the first time in history, nobody knows anymore what the best interest of the child means. How can it be that every legalist knew that for centuries, and then suddenly we don't know? And this is happening a lot. suddenly very profound and old precepts and concepts are unknown. So all that I've been doing really is trying to push the pendulum back to where it should be.
Yes.
So I'm not doing novel work. The novelty is the fact that I was doing the work. The novelty was that I was raising these issues in the Senate. The novelty was that the Senate actually responded, and although we had to fight hard, and we actually got a committee, and a committee of, it was a joint committee of the two houses, and I do not know if you know, but committees are pretty powerful instruments for examination, and many of you may not know because this information is not widely known by our publics anymore. But the houses, both houses, the House of Commons and the Senate, have high curial and judicial powers. We used to be called the High Court of Parliament, and every committee has the powers to investigate, issue subpoenas, summon witnesses, and to hold people in contempt if they offend in any way. But this is not well understood. And a person, if a person by the Criminal Code Section 118, which speaks to proceedings in Parliament, any person who perjures within giving testimony before either of the houses can be charged with perjury. So it's a pretty powerful system. The problem in today's community is most people don't know how it works, and they don't know how to work it. And I made it my business to master what is called the law of Parliament, which means I can rise at any moment and I can challenge anything that's coming on the floor. I can arrest things from happening on the floor. May not be able to arrest it for more than 2 weeks. It depends on the issue and what you can.
It's sort of like the masters of the Senate in the United States who are skilled at that. I was wondering.
It's a real skill. But this is the first time ever it's been applied to this issue, man-woman relations.
Are you working alone? Do you have allies who are working with you? I'm curious about that.
I have always had a lot of support. I had a lot of interference from extreme feminists.
Shall we just decide? Are we going to call them extreme feminists, radical feminists?
Well, we should choose a word.
I think we should, because, I mean, all of us would agree. In the very beginning, it was presented to all of us across the Western world that this was women asking for equality. So they were equity feminists, which actually many men also joined. But behind it was another whole method that was happening, and it was kept very quiet for quite a while. So I call them the radical feminists.
I'm comfortable with that phrase.
How about you? You okay with that?
I'm quite happy with that. There was a time years ago, a long time ago, I would have called myself a radical feminist, meaning I wanted change for women. But I have not even used the word to describe myself feminist for a long time because I was too fearful of ever using it, unless I was associated with
Can
that
I just
side.
ask you, what would you think now, in the position you're in, what is the biggest danger that you can see that is actually going to challenge the whole concept of the family being two people living under one roof with their children?
Oh, it's been very seriously challenged. And in the name of equality, it has been very, very seriously challenged. And, you know, many things are springing to my mind, but I think we have to work even harder again to arrest this continuing degradation and denigration of men. And, you know, every day I hear this Duluth model, which is basically men are bad, women are good, and so on. But we have to challenge any and every injustice. End of story. I'm a certain age in life, but other soldiers have to come.
Not behind me. I was going to ask you, can you think of a time in history when there has ever been not only a viciousness between men and women, well, women against men,
Right.
or a time when the concept is that men are now redundant. I can't actually think of any time.
You know, partly maybe because I'm in California and it's a very liberal state. I think there's been a backing away from radical feminism.
Yes.
That's the hope, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think much more young women are more objective, more empathic with men, more sensitive to men's issues, more open to the findings that we've been sharing here. So that's why I have a kind of a different, and I'm sort of hopeful. The thing that I was also thinking as you were talking is that the nuclear family is really changing. I mean, married couple, husband, wife, raising kids. That model is slowly evolving. People are living together and not married. People are single and raising children. Gay and lesbian individuals are raising children. So the old nuclear model of husband, wife, children, husband works, wife stays home is that's what we grew up with, but I don't think that's the future. And therefore the legal system hasn't coped with that particularly well. I'm not an expert in that area, but of the guidelines for children who are being raised with common law situations or with single parents,
But
gays,
But the
etc.
legal system has been responding, but in the wrong direction.
Uh-huh.
Not to preserve the nuclear family, but to assist its undoing. For example, some of the statutes around marriage, altering the definition of marriage to include homosexual couples. The term natural parent has disappeared. Years ago, a child, you could say the natural parent means the biological. It used to be biological parent, but then it was the whichever. That term in some of the statutes has become now legal parents
Uh-huh.
to accommodate issue of homosexual parents. But it's a work around the fundamental fact of the natural parent. So in other words, if there are instances of what do you call it when a woman has a child for surrogate parent. So one has to be aware that those notions have been carried into law, but no one in law has addressed the question of the original natural parent who fathered or mothered that child in the first place.
Yes.
So it's happening, but it's a very incomplete process, which is just suspending the fact of having to deal with these issues legally and morally in future years. And I have no doubt that the complications will arise with many children. Children are very curious creatures, and questions that they may not ask in their youth will come in their adulthood. For example, on adoption, children now can put their names into the registry, and the parent can, and if the two match up, they can discover who the adoptive parents
Right.
were. So these questions have not been answered yet in respect of the parent who is the child who is 25 and really wants to know who really fathered me,
Right.
or
With him,
Who mothered me.
Yeah, but we have to remember that, as far as we know, 50% of the genes of the mother and 50% of the father creates the psyche, the if you like, the hardware of the child. And at the moment, we're so busy experimenting with different kinds of relationships, we forget, because when you're talking about that massive bonding, which is actually the recognition of the mother and the baby, because 50% of her is that baby and the dad.
Yeah.
I don't know that we can ever actually remove that, because all the time in the refuge, time and time again. The mothers would come in, particularly those that had been adopted or taken into care, and very, very quickly, who is my mother? Who is the times we spent actually finding out on their behalf who act, and the question is, always to me, why? Why did my dad abandon me? Why did my mum give me away? See, I think we've got to be very careful with all our social, scientific experiments with human nature. Because
and human flesh, human people.
Well, also the fact is that there is a bond, and it's the strongest bond. It's stronger than anything a scientist can make between a mother and a father fathering his children. And I suppose the biggest tragedy for me is it's going to take such a huge effort to either, you can't roll it back, the genie's out of the bottle, but for men to be in a position to say, this is my child, I have this right, and by default I've lost the power to take care of my children. And when men kill themselves, and I've been involved in many men who have killed themselves, it is because there is part of that man that's felt as absolute failure because he could not protect his children, particularly where a man knows that he has been dragged from the home, not just by the machinations of the woman, but by the courts, particularly by social services and social workers. And this innocent man, not only has he been condemned for supposed violence against him and his children, but the worst thing you can do to a man is accuse him of molesting his children. And and that in Canada is called a silver bullet.
And the weapon of choice.
Yes. And in many of the refuges and shelters, we call them refuges in England, across the Western world, there are, because they're rabid, many of them, radical feminists, the first thing they do when the woman comes in, they're not interested in who she is, what she's done, or even of her as a person, or the children. They are parts of the bullets that these radical feminists can use against men and fathers. We have Harriet Harman in England. She's been a woman's minister, and she's been very senior in the Labour Party. She's the one that wrote a policy document that said men are not necessarily harmonious to family life. And another woman, Patricia Hewitt, who was also, good heavens, they all end up as ministers for women, said, yes, we need more men in primary schools, but unfortunately men can't be trusted. And that is this negative climate. It's like a murky cloud that actually exists in the very powerful echelons of all our governments. And this is what I'm interested in today, and I would like you to please give us your opinions. It's not just the three of us. Where do we go from here? We know that we are absolutely backed by research that you're famous for and the work that you've done. But we know it. It's a matter of fact that the gender war is completely manufactured, and that for 40 years since this first moment that we realized the domestic violence and what was going on behind front doors, we know that now. It's been proven beyond a shadow of doubt. But why are no government ministers or anyone involved doing anything about it? Why is it going to be left, I think, to the men's movement to have to get themselves together and to develop a strategy to move this whole dialogue on? We cannot go on having conferences anywhere in the world talking about the issues, going over the issues. What we seriously have to now talk about, where do we go from here? And I think if there's any future for loving each other and our children, men and women are going to have to work together. And that's my great hope. Does anybody have something to ask or to contribute? Go ahead.
Senator Cruz, I have...
Why don't you come closer so you could use the microphone?
Yes, ma'am. I have a two-part question, please. In regards to public policy, okay, so my first question is, I'm interested in the inner workings of cabinet meetings and the discussions, the formulations of public policy. Back in 1999, Ontario's Child and Family Services Act went through a very significant amendment called Bill 6. that Bill 6 severely empowered the Children's Aid Societies to increase the severity of their litigation in ways and degrees never before seen. Now, Bill 6 was based on a 77-page document called Protecting Vulnerable Children, which came out of meetings by this expert panel on child protection, 8-member panel. Anybody who wants to read that can Google fixcas.com, Protecting Vulnerable Children. We got it through Freedom of Information. Now, that process was insiders only. They did not allow advocates for children and families, family unit preservation, to be involved. The 8-member panel, I would say that 7 of the 8 members derived a significant, if not entire, salary from child protection litigation. The head of the panel was a Superior Court Judge, Mary Jane Hatton, born and raised in Sarnia, Ontario, who was a lawyer for the Children's Aid Society when she was appointed to the bench. Now, what I want to know is, I don't believe you've ever been a minister in the cabinet,
No, and there's no danger that I will be soon.
but you probably have greater information than we would. What I'm wondering is, during those province of Ontario government cabinet meetings, when they were discussing Bill 6 and the public policy, would those ministers have speculated on negative impacts that the legislation might have on people? For example, I also, through Freedom of Information, I got a listing of 47 citations naming the Children's Aid Society as a respondent in lawsuits here in Ontario. From 1997 to 2012, Children's Aid have been sued 47 times. So that's my first part of the question.
And
The
some
second-
of those 47 times have been successful.
Right. Now, the second part of the question is, what I want to know is, does the legal doctrine, presumption of regularity, omnia praesumuntur rita acta esse, perhaps, does public policy trump the criminal code?
No policy can trump any law.
What I'm wondering is there an unwritten rule, like a type of collusion? What we hear is, for example, when the Children's Aid Society involves police officers to effect an apprehension.
Okay, let me just say to you, what he's raising is a very profound question that goes to the heart of our system of governance, which has divided jurisdictions between provinces and the federal and the federation, the federal government, and then the provincial government, parliaments, and so on. You raise a lot of questions, and a lot of things are going through my mind, and let me see if I can get some of them out. Cabinet is a secret organization. Cabinet has no legal existence, neither does the Prime Minister. What Her Majesty has is what we call an advisory council called the Privy Council. Some of the questions you've asked I can't answer because that's the provincial stuff, but I can speak from the federal perspective. So, policy is made usually in secret and adopted by the cabinet if they're going to bring it forth in the form of legislation in secret. So secrecy is a huge part of the development of any policy. And when I'm saying policy here, I'm just not thinking of a piece of paper that on which the statute is based. I am thinking of the statute as it's formed and hits the floor and moves through the changes. Let me tell you, first of all, any statute, any bill which begins in the House, you're extremely lucky if you can get a comma change between the beginning and the end. In the process of this, quite often, huge defects and huge mistakes are discovered. So the government is usually amenable and open to having those corrected. But in respect of fundamentally altering the policy, forget it. Forget it. It's not going to happen unless you have people on the floor who have the parliamentary skill and dexterity to stop it and build enough support of it that opinion of people has to be taken into account. And it happens. It happens. It really does happen. And the Senate in the last many years have done that many times on different bills. When you come to something like child protection, the language has all changed. You know, you call this now, and I wrote it down here, the child something act.
Child and Family Services Act.
Right. That didn't used to be called that. The language keeps changing as the bills change. You can see the forces at work. That used to be called the Child Welfare Act. And that's all it dealt with, the protection of children. The protection of the children is owed to them by virtue of the king or the queen's powers that we call the parens patriae, the supreme parent. So I'll give an example. And if you were alive to these things, you would see these subtle changes moving all the time. Years ago, there was a position here in the province called the official guardian. It is now has been renamed for the last many years a children's lawyer. A child's lawyer is not the same as a child's guardian. You know, the position of the official guardian, and if people understood that the Constitution is one single comprehensive cohesive framework by which to think, they would be alive to those changes and not welcome them. And this is happening everywhere, so that the language is no longer consistent with the old text on the law. So children's protection is a system of mighty powers. You have to understand how mighty those powers. And the government possesses a power that is virtually absolute to protect a child in danger. So if somebody were to walk in and say, there's a child, somebody's trying to kill a child next door or something terrible like that, let's not even try to imagine an example, just say something terrible. These systems can move in immediately and go and get that child.
But you see, I think that
But
makes...
we don't understand that, but they do wrong things.
Well, this is my concern. I can only talk, obviously, about England, where I work. And what's happened is we've had a sort of wholesale stealing of children. And what tends to happen the moment, because as far as I can see, the best interests of the child has meant that the state is now in a much more powerful position to decide the best interests of the child and not the parents. So now we have the state in the form of the agencies of the state, who, if they can actually make a decision that the father, because at one point he had a row with his wife, can no longer see the child because he is a wife beater, or whatever the state decides. And we have gotten to a position, and it's strange because my father was a diplomat. He was an old China hand. And when in the 49, he and my mother and brother, we were in boarding schools, was sent back to Tin Sin. That's when the communist revolution was happening at its height, and that was 1949, and they marched in and captured my parents and my brother, and they were under house arrest for 3 years, and we didn't see them. The interesting part of this is how the Marxist state, which was the most important thing that should happen, if you want to disenfranchise a man, then you can control the rest, what's left of the family. A man will not work for the state while he has a family. Come first will be his wife and then his children, or his partner and children. So it became necessary, certainly in Engels' time and Marx and Lenin, that the family had to be destroyed. And in a sense, when I was watching in 1970-71, I was seeing the same idea. We were actually asked in our own homes to form our collectives. And the most sinister thing, I thought, is that you were asked to invite your women friends to your house in groups all across England, all across America, all across the Western world. And the whole point was we had to, what was the phrase? We had to, it was a consciousness raising.
Yes,
we had
yes.
to raise our
Right,
consciousness.
right.
And the consciousness raising was that your partner, your male, your husband was oppressing you. And I remember having this argument, and so many of the women, because they weren't politically, you see, a lot of women in England weren't politically literate at all. They just looked at this new movement that was emerging that suddenly said, you can have it all. This is this new concept. You have been abused, you have been patronized, you have been held, and you've been housewife slaves. And I was this lone voice saying, hello, actually, I want to be married, I want to have children, I think it's a luxury to stay at home, and my husband goes out to work. So I have choices, he doesn't. But with that kind of consciousness raising, very slowly it has moved from being a street movement with the early days of feminism, an equity movement, to actually a world dominating violent movement that if it is not stopped, if it is not exposed, if it is not made clear what the agenda is, there will be no family life. There will be lots of alternatives, but fathers will not hold on to their children.
Okay, let me.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so let's look at where things are going,
Yeah.
where they might be going. So, I mean, within my field of social science research, I've seen a lot of positive changes in a short period of time. When I first started, there were very few, if any, journals that would publish work that showed that there was gender parity in domestic violence. Now there are quite a few. There were, the peer review system was rigged in the old days, that articles wouldn't be published if they did show that men were victims. Now that is much clearer, there's much more objectivity there. The other issues that have emerged over time is that there's a greater acceptance within the scholars in the field that this is factual as opposed to political. So and the third thing that I notice is that the consumers of the research, like students in the university, as well as maybe fellow faculty in women's studies, are much more accepting of this. So I have seen that as a positive thing. Now the question is, how does it get out to the broader environment, to the media, to courts, to police, to the legislature? And that's what you've been dealing with. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think that, both Canada and England, things are more oppressive than in America in general.
I think that's true. Canada is the first,
Yeah.
most oppressive country I've ever had the pleasure of trying to do something here.
So how does change take place? I think it starts within individuals changing their views. It has to reach a certain critical mass that then enough people say, this is either ridiculous or we certainly need to do that. I think legislation will be the last thing to go, not the first thing to go.
Oh, but they're doing the first. They're doing.
Oh, well, they've done it already. They've kind of
they're
like
doing
boxed you in. But to get the changes where you would like them, I think it's going to come before that, maybe through personal relationships.
But this also goes even like it gets larger. It's sort of like the onion. You keep
Peeling it.
unraveling and peeling it. The fact of the matter is that we cannot survive as peoples if this stuff is continuing.
I agree.
Women are the carriers of future generations, and birth rates are dropping very, very low to the point where many of us are going to disappear. So this sort of thing has to be looked at in a holistic
Yeah.
impact, because yes, the nuclear family But it's not just the nuclear family that is disappearing. It is people. We are disappearing. You know, I mean, the demographers who know how many children have to be produced to continue the
in some
existence of the
countries,
group.
the
But it's
world
happening
population
here.
is 7 billion plus and growing.
Yeah.
But in certain countries, the birth rate is low.
Well,
can I just
it's-
say before
there are
we-
peoples in Canada disappearing.
Yeah.
I mean, you can prove this by just go to look at the churches. Look at the large numbers of the historically Anglo-Saxon churches, which are closing because there are no people coming to people them.
I can see, but I wanted to ask you actually.
Yeah.
I can see in the top of the academic world, which is in a way quite closed off from day-to-day people like myself,
Right.
because I'm looking at the horror stories that you're hearing in universities, where the whole rape culture, for instance, that is actually, it seized the imagination, as far as I can see, of.
That's true.
And your figures for men leaving universities and not applying are actually frightening.
Right.
They certainly are in England. And they just set up these kangaroo courts because, as one young English professor said to me, I have to keep a low profile because the chancellor's a woman, she's a radical feminist, the vice chancellors. So many women have moved into these big, powerful positions, and they have no interest in men attending universities. They want the exclusivity of women-only universities. I know the younger women will object to this,
Right.
but at the moment it's in full flood, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we've seen a decline in male students throughout the United States.
Yes.
I mean, it used to be 60-40 male to female. Now it's 60-40 female to male.
Yeah,
And that's pretty national.
it is. But and this incredible rape culture that all men are potentially rapists. I mean, the other day, this woman was talking about a man, and she just looked at this. Maybe it was just an ordinary man in the street. She said to me, "He looks a bit rapey." I just stood there thinking, well, that's him done.
Yeah, right.
Okay, where are we moving forward to? Has anybody in the audience have a comment that directly relates to the idea that where do you think the next moves should come from?
Oh, I do.
Well, should we
Well,
try?
Let's give some chances to
Come.
other voices.
If you want to come and speak to the microphone.
I think our next direction should be heavily focused on forcing the ideological grip of feminism away from academia, away from legislation, and letting ideologically free research and information to be predominant and have less emotionally charged comments and research being used to make decisions, because they're blinding a lot of people. I have a lot of discussions trying to explain to people that, on the subject of rape culture, I translated that to be about black people. I just replaced men with black people. That's all I did. I was called a racist. And then I said, well, why isn't it sexist? Oh, that's different. Hate speech is hate speech. And they refuse, like, these people, they refuse to look at what they're saying without the ideology behind it. We need to get people to separate that, and the more we can do that, the more clear and concise and intelligent decisions and legislations we can enforce. That is my opinion.
Okay. Has anybody else got something to add to that? Go ahead. Yeah.
That way you get better.
And right after this gentleman, I have a comment, a question for the professor.
Okay.
I guess I've been involved, regretfully, in this type of matter for quite a few years now. And it's hard to boil it down. And I think one aspect that I think would really would help move things along in a positive way would be to, I guess, eliminate the secret court. And I think secret court buries the statistics. You can't see what's going on. And what happens is when the children CAS or the CPS take someone to court, parents to court, and the children are taken, it's all done behind closed doors. You can't find out anything about that. You can't see the decision. Even with names redacted, you can't get any information. In fact, I recently went to a courthouse, and I sat in the gallery, and I knew it was for this couple who actually didn't have any children. They had no children, but nonetheless, the CAS or CPS in the States were on the other side, and the argument was that the Child Protection Act or Child and Family Services Act applied. Now, but they didn't have any children. There were no children. So I thought this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. This can't be hidden from the public. There are no children. So I sat there. The judge said, "Well, you have to leave, sir, because this is a child protection hearing." And I asked her if I could please speak, and she was kind enough and permitted me. I went up front and I spoke, and I said, "With all due respect, Your Honor, there are no children. It's impossible to be a child protection proceeding." And I said, "I understand that this lady is pregnant," which she was, but I said, "As far as I know with the law, that doesn't count as a child yet, unless you want to. That's going to, affect abortion laws and everything else. If you want to determine someone who is pregnant or a couple contemplating children have a child." The judge, however, found that no, indeed, the CPS or CAS does have jurisdiction over couples that don't have children, and the proceeding went ahead.
Can I just say, is she actually saying that that she has jurisdiction
Yes.
over the unborn child?
Yes. So they said that now the CAS has jurisdiction to investigate parents that are contemplating having children. But I requested a copy of the court order from the government or from the ministry that handles it, and they said because it's a child protection proceeding, you actually can't get a copy of the court order. I requested a copy of the transcript because I said I spoke at that, and they said we can't give you a copy of the transcript either. And I said that the judge actually made a ruling to say that I'm allowed to be there in the gallery, and the government said you're not entitled to that ruling even though it applies to you. So I think it's wrong that the CAS or CPS now has their powers expanded to people who don't even have children or contemplating it.
It's difficult,
but it's all in secret court.
Well, yes, but
What was the legal basis for your making those interventions? Because people just can't walk into
Exactly.
the court and make
Yes.
interventions.
Yes.
So somehow or the other, you must have had some sort of an interest.
Well, I had an interest because I heard that this couple who she was pregnant, but there was no child. I was
Pregnant,
thinking
was she?
she's pregnant, but not a child.
I know, but how
How
far
far
along?
along?
She was quite well along.
Because make no mistake about it, and I've been in those courts many times with in different cases, and there are many options that women who are very pregnant without the capability to look after. There is lots of provisions. I do not know exactly where they will step in to give them assistance. Now, what we don't know is what were the issues before the court. You haven't told us that. There
Was
were
it
actually
secret,
being,
though?
It was that's a different issue. But what are the issues themselves?
I see
what
what
was
you're
the
saying.
action that was being, what was being determined?
but the problem.
What was the fight, or what was the problem that the court is even involved? You have not made that clear to us.
Supervision order of the family, Children's Aid Society was
The supervision order or the family, or a supervision order or an order to look after the unborn. There have been instances, I remember a case very, very clearly, of a woman who had killed other children. and there was a lot of preparation trying to get in on the action, so to protect the next child, with which she was very pregnant at the time. So I don't know the circumstances, but I'm just wondering what was the issue actually before the court.
Excuse me, Senator, I could answer that.
You know that? Go ahead.
I actually represented the girl who was 16. I represented her in the court, and on that same day obtained
She was
a.
how old? 16.
She was 16 and pregnant. She was probably ready to give birth.
Big, well, they do have very serious
Now,
powers. In
the
that
issue
case.
before the court is that the couple actually were before the court to stop the apprehension. They were to try to get a restraining order. Children's Aid already had told them, we're going to apprehend your child.
Well, this is what I was suspecting.
Yeah.
Something like this was going on.
So they
You
had
see?
decided to apprehend
Okay.
the child before it was even born. There had been no history of abuse of children, I think, and
No history of abuse.
no history of abuse. No,
We don't know. We don't know.
No, he says there's no history.
no
You-
history of abuse. I met with the parents, spoke to the parents, met them, but that was the
But-
issue before the judge was
Okay.
simply to.
I would love to look at that case.
Yeah.
But there was a very famous case here that broke my heart years ago, and a lot of tragedy. And one particular one, the finest Children's Aid family court workers, one went down, her career went down on this. And where, I don't remember the facts, but the particular mother had had other children perish in her care. And was in hospital about to give birth. And one of the doctors remembered that of this history, and the Children's Aid came in and took that child before you could sneeze, and they were right to do that.
I
They
think
were
that's
quite right.
fair enough.
That's
I mean,
fair
there are
enough.
places, but
Now,
you know,
yeah,
just
but
remember.
when we're discussing real life issues here with real life people, I get a little cautious, because it's one thing to discuss a case on the facts, on the evidence, and on the law. It's another thing to be discussing people in this kind of way, and I'm not comfortable doing it because they should not. I don't think we should treat of this situation in this way. It's not fair to those individuals. They may be watching, they may be greatly hurt. So I would be a little
Well,
cautious, but I would love to know more.
Okay, but
about
I want to
it.
just say that as far as I'm concerned, I work in the High Court in the Strand in England. And my overall opinion after 40 years of many, many cases, yes, there are absolutely times when people have to lose their children because they are a danger to the child or whatever. But it's become so secretive and so corrupt in our case. It is well known to people who are in the court system, to families going into the court system, that can only say until the court systems have to open up and be responsible for the decisions they take. There was one case when I came up for contempt of court because I had hidden a mother and 3 children out in Southern Ireland against the judge's orders. I knew the counts of violence and sexual assault that this man had against his children. And when the matter came to court and they couldn't find the children, I was hauled in and I lied under oath. I said I didn't know where she was. That, at the end of the day, I was proven right because they gave the children back to him and he molested his little 4-year-old daughter.
Oh.
The court doesn't say sorry. According to the judge when I was hauled in, the court had never been scandalized in its history in this fashion, and that is what the court was bothered about. I had scandalized the court, and I was given, it was a fine in those days of 3,000 guineas, which in 1970s is a lot of money, or 9 months in jail. And the court never has to say sorry because the court isn't wrong. And I just think this whole concept of the secrecy, of the fact that in one particular case, the judge decided, God knows why, that because I come across this woman at a private party, I had actually taken the woman and hidden them against the judge. So the police just marched in, and what they do is, because they can actually give you a document that says you're to turn up in court, and this is what you're guilty of, but you may not discuss that with even your partner or close friends or anybody. That to me is a totalitarian state. It's not a democracy. How can we have secret courts in a democracy? Can anybody explain that to me?
Well, let's
More
go.
and more so with, the security now, with terrorism, everything is now secret.
No, in the instances of children, there are great steps taken in the issue of the publicity of the names. Like, for example, the Juvenile Offenders Act, those kinds of things. The names are not made public, so as to protect them for the future. Like if a 10-year-old child does some heinous crime, you cannot just go around broadcasting the name. So, but I want to make 2 points very quickly. If a child is in the care of the court or under the supervision of the court, under the old those powers, if that person is with child themselves, the court has jurisdiction. The court does have jurisdiction. Make no mistake, that child is a minor. So there is jurisdiction there. I don't know the details of the case, and I'm not really comfortable with it, but we must know that there are scores of children on any given day that are living their lives under orders, whether they're supervision orders or apprehension orders or whatever. And I've worked in some of those cases when I led on the apprehension myself, because I saw an incident where this woman who was very limited mentally, in the old days we said retarded, that language has disappeared. I saw her do something that could have killed the child very quickly. And I shall never forget that. And I led on that apprehension myself. And I swear to God, it was a sad, terrible, terrible thing, because the mother of the child had no understanding that she was hurting the child. And I remember her neck was stretched to bite. I remember trying to get this child and trying to keep my hands out of her teeth, away from her mouth. And she would look up. She had grown up in one of these schools as the subject of some of our discussions earlier. In those days, there's a new language for them.
They were called training schools back then.
No, this was not a training school. This was a home for children who were brain damaged or something like that. And
Group homes?
yeah, they're all group homes, but they had a category. But I could look that up someplace. And she, in the process of, started to repeat the name she used to be called as a child. And she was saying things like, I know I'm a nasty son of a this. And she was repeating to me the terms that she would have been called as a child in that institution. So you see these things repeating itself again and again. But coming back to the more important issues of what are really relevant to us here, is that in committee in 1998 at one point we had testimony before us that 2/3 of the complaints about abuse that are put before Children's Aid are proven unsubstantiated.
And there's a shocking figure for
Okay,
you.
and that at the time was mirroring what we were seeing and what we were hearing. But this is a vast area of law and an area of jurisprudence that is fraught with dangers at every given moment. And I worked in one of those youth protection schools when I was a younger of 19 or 20, and you had little kids who were 12 years old, adult in every other way but mind, and so on. So it's a huge thing. And the boys youth protection school, they had other problems as well. But these are big problems, and something I think they deserve discussion and they deserve debate. But I think we should understand what it is and the weightiness of the problems that we're discussing.
Attila, would you like to ask something?
Yes, I would. Actually, I would like to make a comment I have been involved with Children's Aid Society from being investigated by way of some very nasty allegations, totally unfounded, and I've learned just how very powerful the Children's Aid Society is and can be.
In any country, not
And it-
just here.
Everywhere.
Yes, and I've
Yeah.
seen that in England. I've seen it in my work in the United States, in Canada. And what I had done is once I cleared up my own situation, I became a member of the York Regional CAS, and I met with Patrick Lake, the executive director, many times. And I spoke to him about reforming the Children's Aid Society. They have far, far too much power and nowhere near enough accountability. Everything's in secret. I know Samantha, I should say, Velvet Martin will not mind me saying this because I helped her bring her story out. She would talk about her daughter that had died after being in care of CAS, and she would refer to her daughter as S period, M period. I said, "What is this? She has passed away. Well, what are we protecting her from?" And I said, "Her name is Samantha Martin, and you need to scream that out." I would.
Be careful, this is a public meeting.
I understand that,
Okay,
and
yes.
this has been very public. She has the
But
mother.
we don't know the circumstances. You may know them, but nobody else here knows them.
Fair enough.
I just
Fair
say
enough.
to you, be cautious.
I thank you for that advice. So when I met with Patrick Lake and I explained to him my concern of how we need to have reform of the CAS, he very laughingly looked at me and says, "You know what? There's been others that have tried, but any politician that dares to go against the CAS in any capacity is like committing political suicide." And that struck me as something very chilling, that they hold this much power. And in fact, I worked with a family, a mother. The Children's Aid Society had assured her that they would not be apprehending her child. And it wasn't a day after she gave birth, literally breastfeeding this child for the very first bit of times, and they tore this child off the mother. I ended up meeting with our MPP, who intervened and ended up restructuring and bringing back this child into the family because they're two decent, a mother and a father. But I'd like to move ahead and bring this back
I
to
just
domestic.
want to support what you were saying too, as well, to a point. To any man, it is soul destroying to be accused falsely of abusing or molesting his own child. There's something inherent in the heart and soul of men that something like that is so repugnant to them. And I remember having one father before me who was in tears saying, "Accuse me of murder, but don't accuse me of that." And it was the weapon of choice at the time. And if you go and look up my record, two speeches, and this is back in 2000, because I used to receive cases by the truckload, and I would methodically go through all the cases and read them, judgments and so on. And I put 52 cases of decisions that proved that the charges, the accusations were unprovable and unsubstantiated. And I put them on the record of the Senate. I mean, I spoke to this on the floor.
Love to get a copy of that.
Sure, as you can, okay. But what I'm trying to say to you is that people have rights, and those little people have rights to have their names not so well known in the public that they will never have a chance in life. So if you're raising concerns about the validity sometimes of involving those powers, that's a different question, and so, but I just say to you that it is a very difficult business when people make allegations to ascertain at every time who are the tellers of the truth. And for a period of time, women were assumed to be the tellers of the official tellers of truth. But it's a very sad and very tragic era, and I've been very close to a lot of those cases.
I can speak
And I've
to
seen
that.
children suffer, you know, where I personally was intervening. I remember in my shelter seeing a little child wrapped around the foot of a table, hugging it like a doll. And of course, to me, this is abnormal behavior. And when I investigated this, and I had quite a network of support. My public health nurse was here, and I was in, and I said, "There's something very wrong with this child. I want you to check her for me carefully." Anyway, this child was lagging in development. She was lagging. It was a sad, terrible thing, and I'll never forget it. As I probed, I discovered that this woman also had mental problems, but she had a boyfriend who did not like this child, and this child was spending endless days in that room with only a blanket on the floor, with a table that the child used to wrap around the table for almost for affection. And you were talking about therapeutic responses, and in our 2 weeks or so that we had this child mound us, if anybody took up this child and held the child would not let go. The child would not let go. So we used to pass the child from staff to staff, so it would get that sort of human warmth and human contact. And then I was able to set up a program to have somebody visit her every day.
But you know,
and so on.
Anne,
But it's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing.
And what concerns me is this is the 21st century.
Yes.
And if all we can do is to rip children away from their parents
Oh, I don't believe, right.
without giving the parents a chance and a therapeutic intervention, maybe they can't cope. Maybe they do have mental illness problems. Maybe they have problems of aggression. But if we could give them a safe place to be with their children and give them a second chance to learn how to... You can't ask a mother to mother if she hasn't been mothered, or a father to father. And we don't go down that road. We simply go down the road of wholesale punishing everybody.
No, there's a lot of money that is being spent in those cases to
On
do
keeping
that,
children in
no,
care.
No. To work with therapists, all kinds of people working with those mothers. Make no mistake about it.
If I could just take a moment
Anyway,
to...
it's a very...
Yeah, I think
We should wrap up.
yes, we've got
should
about...
wrap up.
you-
Anyway,
But
it's
sorry.
it's an area that can break your heart in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I know.
I have
Can
a-
you say something? Have you got something you could say in a few
Anyway.
minutes?
How are we going to wrap it up?
Okay,
Yeah, well, let's just wrap it
just
up.
1 second. I have a very important question for the professor. You have collected, it seems to me, something like 50 years worth of experience, and you've put together documentation which really is reflective of what the scientific proof is of what domestic violence is with respect to the balance between men and women and how it affects children. And my question to you is, what do you recommend that we do, Professor Feuerbert, for us to take that data? Because it's going to be on the shoulders of people like me who are almost 50 to carry that torch that you've been carrying and bring it somewhere where it's going to shed some light on bringing about the necessary change so that the judicial system, so that the police forces, that the education systems are reflective of the scientific data
Right.
that is there.
That's a good question. And as I've been listening and hearing the struggles that people have had in Canada and England, I think the vehicle to take the next step is the media. People have to know about this. It's not going to change unless there's enlightened legislators like we have here, enough of them, a critical mass of them, to make changes.
Right, a mass.
It really has to come through the media. It has to come through stories that reporters who are objective and interested in this topic share. It comes through TV shows that are exposing the imbalance and the quote lies that have been promulgated. And there have been some shows. There was 2020 did a show on ABC maybe 10 years ago. Barbara Walters was involved that talked about domestic violence in a very accurate way, some of the research that draws on the material I've shared. So I think that's a really good positive step to take. Now, actually, the research that I've been working on doesn't deal very much with children at all. It's really dealing with
It's tough.
partner violence. And a lot of it has to do with partners who are not married. So it's dating partners, etc. So, but I think that there is a theme that runs through that then can be extrapolated towards the effects on children. So I think the media is the first step. Aaron was talking about the men's movement, becoming more active in sharing. You know, the problem is that this doesn't affect, it's like a small slice of men in the larger thing, and men in general are not we're more individualistic, we're less into cooperative, etc. So I think it's going to be hard to get out on the streets and petition the way that other groups have petitioned.
I'm very interested in, because it's when I came across A Voice for Men online that I suddenly began to recognize that men have been learning over the last 40 years. They really have been learning how to get together and how to make the changes. So I have great hope.
What examples do you
Of
have
the men?
Yeah.
Well, the examples, for instance, as far as I'm concerned, is that A Voice for Men has been going for a very long time. And I saw group after group of men. It was kamikaze because they didn't know. And I said this to men's groups. You don't know how to organize yourself over emotional issues. You can organize yourselves to make money. You can organize yourselves to engineer a bridge. But when you have to help each other, you don't know how to do it. And I think men are emotionally more sophisticated than they have been for a very long time.
Okay. All
You
right.
don't
Well,
sound as though
well,
you've got much hope.
Well, I don't know. I
But
mean, I
the
see
thing
men
is-
getting together, to root for their sports teams, but I don't see them quite
But-
organizing around it.
But there's a lot happening, because yesterday you presented us, I thought, with brilliant data,
Uh-huh.
which showed that men's violence against women has been decreasing every
Yes,
year,
that's true.
and women's violence has not been.
Right.
So, I mean, that's out there in people's daily lives, So
Yeah, and
so
that-
there is change happening
Yeah.
on the ground.